Here we are, back again at the fourth Arctic Frontiers Offstage session, after the fourth Big Picture session, this time on Beyond Traditional Security at Arctic Frontiers 2025. I have again three guests with me, starting from my left or your right is Stephanie Pessard, a senior political scientist at RAND, office in LA, but you have office I guess, all over the US. Opposite side here is Dave Marsh, advisor at the Wilson Center, the Polar program of the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington DC, and also an Arctic Frontiers emerging leader. And to my right, to your left, well-known editor of the Barents Observer, Thomas Nielsen. Thank you very much to all of you for being here and discussing traditional security, or what we framed at Arctic Frontiers beyond traditional security topics after the big picture. What have we heard? Obviously, like for many years, maybe Thomas, I want to start with you as you're the Norwegian here. Norway's mantra in the Arctic was high north, low tension. We know that this has changed, you know. Your foreign minister also mentioned that he apparently loved the book called Managing Chaos when he was a young academic. Do we have to manage chaos in the broader complex setting that is the Arctic?
We are at least have to deal with a much more complex world, which definitely include the Arctic. So the answer to that is yes. It's more complex. It's less predictable of the future, and for us as journalists, very more complicated to deal between or to divide between what's facts, what's rumors, what's fakes, what comes from one country, what are the different interests, and so on. And I was sitting in the big plenary session today and listening, and I've been following this Arctic Frontiers conference for all its time, maybe close to 20 years now. And I remember way back when we really talked about high north, low tension. Then it was the climate change that were the big issue of the Arctic, the big threat, the big headlines in the media. It still is, but that's not the topic here. So the Arctic Frontiers has moved from Arctic climate-focused cooperation, low-tension scenario. Today I actually had a feeling that I'm sitting at a security conference, an international security conference, discussing hardcore military issues and the differences between hybrid wars, what is threats, and what we have to prepare for. And if you want to put the word chaos into that, yes, I agree.
Here in the Arctic, we very well know the work you do and the Barents Observer within the Arctic. But do you also talk to a lot of your colleagues outside the Arctic to explain the Arctic to them? Like what we have heard, I think, yesterday is geopolitics taking away kind of the light of what is another real problem, climate change. Is that something that people approach you with? It's like, okay, geopolitics,
yes.
Totally forgetting about the other.
Yes, and that worries me, because I mean, as mankind, we have one very big challenge that we have to deal with, and the only way to deal with that is international cooperation. And today we are into a setting of total opposite, where there is as little cooperation as possible, and the focus, not only for us in the media, but we also have a strong responsibility here, is on geopolitics and war. Russia-Ukraine war, higher tensions between the countries. So it's sad. We should all be working to solve the biggest challenge of the Arctic, which is the climate change that affects the entire world.
Affecting the entire world. I mean, Stephanie, you sit and work and live in Los Angeles, you know, and climate change.
I'm actually based out of our DC office.
All right, so okay. But then I know a colleague of yours, you know, that
yes,
works at least in Los Angeles. But anyways, what Thomas said, you know, the north affects the south in many ways. From a RAND's perspective, you know, managing chaos, you know, talking about traditional or non-traditional security challenges here in the Arctic. What are your 2 cents on that rather complex topic?
Very complex topic, but just to follow on what Thomas was saying, it is definitely a more complex issue also because I see different sort of timelines, and we have to work at the same time on different threats that have different timelines. We have the long-term daily evolving threat of climate change, but it's still something that to some extent is going to have some far-reaching consequences that a lot of people don't see yet, and as a result do not take into consideration yet. There is the risk of a conflict, of a kinetic conflict that is more of a, let's say, a medium-term conflict. If you see some increase in competition, some miscalculation, and there is the immediate threat of the sort of hybrid threats that were discussed during the panel sessions, where every day you have cyber attacks that states have to face and respond to. So you have to be simultaneously ready to tackle major threats on these different timelines, and I think that's very difficult because some of them are more or less aligned with the time of a political mandate, political administration, and all of them are equally important to tackle.
Really interesting point. I want to come back to that later on how do we reach policymakers or the larger society, with regard to these different timelines, because as you said, different interests, different timelines. Talking about timelines though, Dave, you're not only at the Wilson Center, but you're also part of the Arctic Frontiers Emerging Leader Program. Did you tackle that timeline issue somehow in your discussion with your peers? That, okay, it's not only about traditional, non-traditional security topics, but the timeline is a different one. Like climate change it's a different timeline than this medium and short security.
We did, absolutely. And so I'm not sure if you guys caught the video yesterday before the State of Affairs session, where there was a group of emerging leaders. You may have noticed me on the left side of that video. But we raised the question to the entire audience, dealing with the Arctic is a multi-generational problem, and we closed that video saying, the efforts to, I'm paraphrasing here a little bit, the efforts to kind of solve these challenges in the Arctic will not end with my generation. And then we ended with a question to the audience of how will it start with you, which I think was a very powerful line. I'm also a little biased because I wrote that one in the script. But I think it's an important question, which is, we're here as emerging leaders where, a lot of us are early stages in our career, kind of mid-20s, early 30s. And we were asked to come in as a group and talk about what a healthy Arctic is. And to your point, in many ways today in this session did feel like a security conference in Washington, D.C. We tried to think a lot about kind of the east to west dynamic in the Arctic as opposed to the north to south relationship between, say, Washington, D.C. and Alaska or other capitals in their Arctic regions. I was not born in the Arctic. I was born 3,000 miles away from the ocean in Kansas City. I then went to California for college. I then lived in the Middle East for a couple years, so I've spent much of my life away from the Arctic region. But it was fascinating to get to talk to the other emerging leaders and understand their perspectives from across North America and also the European Arctic. And so we did collectively kind of decide, national security. If you go back to the actual definition of that, it is not just security from a military standpoint or political standpoint, but it involves cultural security, which we heard a little bit about today from the Sami researcher on stage, about how nations without states ensure their own national security. It involves environmental, it involves all these other things. And so, yes, I think, unfortunately, the military aspect is kind of front of mind right now. The political sovereignty questions in the Arctic are also front of mind because of comments that are coming out of Washington, D.C. these days. But we must remember that there are these other factors that all kind of wrap together into the notion of national security in the Arctic.
Interesting point. I mean, you mentioned healthy Arctic national security. In discussion today, we also heard about removing vulnerabilities. And for me, coming from a neutral state, comprehensive security, total defense is something new in a way. Thomas, how do you think about or discuss these two topics, comprehensive security, total defense? We heard from the Sami researcher, about empowering people, how important that is, building stronger democracies, not only in the Arctic, but of course globally, but particularly in the Arctic. When you think about total defense, comprehensive security, and then topics like moving beyond traditional security, how do you connect that?
No, it's difficult because we are living. My generation, we have grown up in peace, and when we are entering into gray zone questions, our first response is denial. No, it can't be true. This cable on the seafloor it was an accident, of course. And that were highlighted, I think, very well in the debates today with both the Norwegian foreign minister and the representatives of the other Arctic nations, trying to explain the gray zone in between what is real war and what is information propaganda and what is hybrid actions in between. This is difficult, but we have to, we in the media, we have a big job to do here, and to build resilience, to build awareness of what's going on. And I'm sorry to say, but the best one to help us with that is Russia, because they are the one doing these hybrid attacks on the cables. They are the one that are mapping the infrastructure in the Arctic, maybe as a preparing for action one day. So far, we haven't seen too much of the hybrid attacks in the Arctic, but we definitely see preparing for hybrid operations. In my border area, very close to the Kola Peninsula, we have had people from the Russian Orthodox, or camouflaged as the Russian Orthodox Church, working on behalf of Russia's security intelligence services, mapping infrastructure like drinking water and so on and so on. And that sounds, well, not too dangerous, but why do they do it? And that's important to try to see what's happening with Russian eyes. Why are they doing that? And when we get answers to those questions, it's easier to understand, wow, something is going on here. There is a red line on the activities that
I really like
moving.
your thought of thinking, you know, from denial to asking actually why is something happening.
Yes, we always try to say how are they thinking in Moscow? Why do they do this? They probably don't do it just to show us the finger. They have a bigger plan behind it. This signaling, showing the finger and so on. That's past. We are beyond that. Yes.
Stephanie, you work very closely with policymakers, and sometimes for policymakers when you do your research and your related reports. How do you prepare in that regard, policymakers or the larger society via your work, to be ready for whatever is happening, to be more resilient in many different ways?
So our work is really to inform policymakers through research and analysis. What they do with our research analysis is up to them. This is not, our work is not to influence, only to inform based on the best possible research. So we do a lot of research, yes, on hybrid threats, on how conflict has been evolving, and how, when we talk now about total defense, it's also because we're facing, to some extent, a total threat, where people can be threatened through when they read the news and they read something that is falsehood, when they turn on their computer and they realize that some weird things are popping up on their screen and they've been hacked. Or so at the same time, of course, you don't want to fall into complete paranoia, because that would be sort of the opposite of what Thomas was saying, was like, no, it can be that bad, it can be a threat. You don't want to go into everything is a threat and my life is becoming impossible, because that's also, that would be really having hostile powers winning if you get to that feeling in a society where nothing is safe. So it's something that was mentioned during the panels, the big picture sessions today. Really, where do you find this balance between making people the actors, societies the actors of their own security, without terrifying them and creating more fear than is really needed to ensure that security?
Very interesting point, especially also like Thomas said, growing up in an era of peace, and that does something with a human being, So like is the younger generation, and I'm not talking about young generation, but your younger generation, becoming more cynical about the future? Did you experience that in your discussions, about the future healthy Arctic, in general, the outlook of the world? Are we living in an era where the people that are about or already, creating policy for the future are too cynical and not any more optimistic?
We're both at the same time. I think it's impossible for my generation to not be cynical given the things that we've seen, right? COVID, 2008 financial crisis, going further back, and obviously Crimea and the war in Ukraine. I think those are very fundamental things that stick into people's minds, but I think there's still an optimism. And, before we started recording, we briefly discussed cooperation with Russia back in the 90s, both on kind of dealing with aging military hardware, but also on building the International Space Station, right? So I've spent the majority of my career working in the space industry, where cooperation with Russia has been the norm and the daily activity on board the ISS, and it even continues to this day, even in spite of what's going on in Ukraine. Who knows exactly how much longer that cooperation will continue, but it does. The astronauts living on board are alive every day because of the activities that the Russian component of the space station does. So I think it's important to note that, yes, we've seen these challenges. Yes, I think a lot of us have been to, I personally, this is my first kind of major Arctic conference, but many of my colleagues from the Emerging Leaders Program have been to this and others before. So I think there's some frustration to come to these events and continue to maybe try and talk about important issues for the climate. But now we have to kind of go back and deal with this, Cold War era realpolitik thinking that maybe is detracting from the issues that many who live and work in the Arctic deal with every day. So certainly still optimistic. Hopefully our video that we made kind of communicated some of that, but there's definitely a cynicism that's seeping in on the sides. I'd like to also add, if that's okay, on the total defense concept. It expands from the surface and undersea, but also into the media. It also expands into space. And I'd like to just draw the comparison between the discussion today and the panel yesterday about new space activities here in Norway, which I think are a really interesting element because in some ways they provide a tool to help address some of these, rising great power competition by allowing for better awareness of the Arctic environment, better data about ice and weather. But it also opens up this other gray area that can be exploited, where you have these government-operated satellites. Sometimes they're commercially operated. The lines are a little bit vague. So it's a tool and an opportunity, but also its own challenge. And so I think that's something that we also tried to deal with a little bit in the Emerging Leaders Program, where we got to visit the new Andøya spaceport.
As Thomas alluded to, we talked a lot about security, obviously, and traditional security. It was more a security conference than maybe an Arctic conference, or an Arctic, at least a session. But if we think about maybe less the problem and more the solution, we heard a lot about collaboration, of course, and maybe a different kind of collaboration than we had before February 2022. But when you think a bit ahead, collaborative efforts in the Arctic, how could they look like, taking into account maybe space development, and ever more increased interest of stakeholders that are not based here?
But I think also it's important to remember that we have a lot of open doors still into Russia, which is covering half of the Arctic. It's not a complete Iron Curtain as we had during the Cold War. We in the media, we cooperate with, it's approximately 1,000 Russian journalists that have left the country after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. They are sitting in different places in the Caucasus and in Europe and in the United States. These are very smart people. They want to do their job. They want to write what could put them in prison in Russia. Therefore, they do it from abroad. And we often tend to paint this black picture of Russia, and that the future is very dark, and we get frustrated and so on. But if we look back in history, and we should do that sometime, all the big changes in Russia has happened very suddenly. The revolution back when Lenin was coming in, and all Tsars were kicked out in 1991 with the KGB doing the coup against Gorbachev and trying to stop the glasnost and perestroika and so on. Within some few days, you had this Boris Yeltsin collecting thousands of people in the center of Moscow, and the Soviet Union collapsed. And right now, I agree, it looks very, very dark. But we talk a lot with the exiled Russian community, and they all agree that there will come an opportunity one day, and then we have to act fast. And things might again get back on track. I don't think this will be easy. Russia, as the Foreign Minister Espen Barth Eide said in the session yesterday, that Russia have to prove that it is a well-civilized cooperator on the international stage. But that's the goal. That's what we should hope for. So we will hope for a better future in the Arctic, top of the world, the best place to have international cooperation, including with those that we are not thinking about too much now, like Moscow.
Stephanie, like from a researcher perspective, that is informing policymakers, like how would you answer to Thomas's optimistic, realistic perspective? Like how can we make sure that we are not all about black and white the future? Particularly when it comes to, of course, Arctic issues.
I think I would also share some optimism, maybe in the sense that it seems to me that particularly when we look at hybrid threats, all countries, really, all states are facing similar threats. So everybody is facing disinformation, manipulation of elections, the arson and sabotage episodes that we've seen have been affecting different countries. So I think this necessarily brings together a sense of solidarity and also the sense that you can more easily deter as a group if you share information, if you share intelligence. It's not a case of one country being isolated and being really bearing the brunt of this type of threats and attacks, and everybody else being like, well, sorry for you, but we're in a completely different situation. Everybody's concerned, everybody's facing similar issues, and there is really a lot of benefit to collaborating to face these issues. So I think in a way, again, as Thomas was saying, Russia is helping us here by having this sort of scattershot approach to various European countries, but also the US. And that is, I think, going to be a major driver for cooperation, and already is.
And as we know, you mentioned it, Russia is the biggest Arctic state. It did not leave the Arctic Council. It's still very active, obviously, in the Arctic, for various reasons. We also talked a bit about the power element, the identity element of being a powerful Arctic state. From a Wilson Center perspective, from your current work, and your background in space policy, what can we learn maybe from space collaboration that could help us in Arctic matters, that also like link a bit to this traditional, non-traditional security component?
Sure. I think, in the past, there's maybe been some thinking of, much like Arctic and polar exceptionalism, some sort of space exceptionalism. Sputnik launched in 1957, that was the International Geophysical Year, also an International Polar Year. In many ways, these two regions have been kind of two regions, one region, one domain, have kind of clearly been tied together throughout their histories. Obviously, the United States has a Space Force presence in Greenland, and the Arctic has been used for satellite communications and awareness since space was a thing. So in some ways, they both have had this characteristic of, because they're almost this shared resource and there's reasons we need to collaborate there, there's been this kind of theme of exceptional cooperation. Again, we see it today on the International Space Station, but I'm worried that that's changing, especially in space. We've even seen with the growth of the Chinese space program and the proliferation of commercial satellites, the lines are drawn. It's not as they're not as clear as they once were when you're looking at government-owned versus commercially owned assets. And I think there's a real concern about, if something were to escalate, how do these space assets play a role? We've already seen examples of Chinese space companies providing imagery to Wagner Group in Ukraine, who were then sanctioned by the international community. Where do you draw the line about where commercial imagery and commercial data can be used? So I think in some ways the two domains are very closely tied together. And while there still is opportunity for collaboration and cooperation with Russian scientists and journalists who have had to leave Russia, and we should absolutely explore that. And there are still ways we can continue cooperation in space. My fear is that there's a deadline approaching where that cooperation may not be able to continue. And so I hope that we collectively, as an Arctic community, can find ways to continue that. I hope that if I was having the same opportunity to speak at a space event, I would try and say the same thing. There are ways we can cooperate with Russian space programs. We could also cooperate with Chinese space programs. So we alert the Chinese government every time we deploy things from the International Space Station, every time we do a spacewalk. They don't necessarily respond, but the effort is there. And so there are ways that we can continue to use both domains as an area to cooperate, but also shore up our own defenses.
Thank you. I mean, for the last round of question to all of you, I want to come back to what you alluded a bit to and what has been discussed, the matter of trust and how do we balance an open society versus freedom, whatever that means, and how essential trust is. And I think trust and being an optimistic realist, has been some theme we experienced and we heard of over the last few days. Thomas, from your perspective and your work perspective, how do you balance trying to, counter fake news, working towards an open society, but, being careful when it comes to matters of freedom and actually who you're responsible for, your colleagues you mentioned before?
The easiest answer to that question is pronounced in one word: facts. Stick to the facts. And as long as we do that and do whatever we can to stay away from disinformation or propaganda or being trapped into writing false stories, that's the way further. And we have to remember to protect, or why do we have a military system? Why do we have a military alliance from Florida to Finnmark, from seabed to space in NATO, is to protect the values of these countries and our freedom, our openness, our free and open debate, freedom of speech, freedom of research, etc. Is something we should never put into play. That's what we are working for everyone together.
Also to you, Stephanie, I mean, we all know that we're living in a very polarized world. Here in Europe, you experience the same in the US. Thomas correctly mentioned the importance of facts. But also for the same question to you, how do we balance that? Be an open society, keeping in mind, that not every information can be shared, even is shared, even between allies. How do we manage that? In order to work towards something more optimistic, and less cynical.
It's a very complex question. I mean, we've done a lot of work at RAND on the concept of truth decay, the fact that there is less and less trust in the facts that Thomas is talking about in scientific evidence is not seen as evidence by a large number of people, enough that we need to think about why don't people trust the sources of expertise that they used to trust previously. And how do you continue? How do you do research in front of an audience that does not take evidence-based as something good enough? So that is again an incredibly complex issue, and I think part of it is, yes, obviously sticking with the facts, but also showing transparency of sources. It's not obviously going to solve everything, but it is, I think, the more you communicate, maybe the less opaque you seem, maybe the more trust you create. But again, I think you still will not reach to a certain range of the population that will not believe you regardless, or has chosen some media to trust and will stick with just one line of argument and one line of evidence, which again is not necessarily new, but might be more widespread than before. Again, sufficiently so that we need to think about it in terms of the future of expertise and what it's gonna mean.
Before I give Dave the last word. Thomas, you mentioned 2% of the audience. I think in your previous session on Russia and the war,
It's what I call this flat Earth society.
Flat Earth Society, the 2%.
There is always some.
Do you still aim to reach them, or do you aim to ignore them because you can't reach them? You know, with your work.
Well, we can reach them, but it's for this group itself to reach us, and this portion of or part of the population that do not want to read facts. Well, okay, let's focus on the 98% that want the facts, and let's give them the right arguments to win debates further on. That's I think that's the best answer to that.
Well, thank you very much, Dave. The last complex and big question is to you. I mean, thinking about trust in the Arctic, based on your previous work, based on the Emerging Leader Program, you have been involved, and also being hopefully not a cynical person but an optimistic realist. You know, how would you summarize this session we just listened to, beyond traditional security? You know, in a few words. You know, and what could be, you know, the next steps for some kind of solution. You know, in order to bring us all closer together again.
Yeah, I want to latch on to those last few words you said, bringing us closer together. Now that Sweden and Finland are in NATO, and we've kind of completed the non-Russia NATO alliance in the Arctic, I think this is an opportunity for us collectively to kind of reevaluate from a security standpoint how we're going to play the next 10, 20, 30 years, how we're going to cooperate, how we're going to ensure that we make sure the 2%ers who want to believe whatever they're going to believe do not affect the opinions of the other 98%. We had a really interesting conversation with Camilla Stoltenberg to talk about kind of some of the challenges she sees from her position at Norse as the Emerging Leaders cohort, and she talked a lot about education in Europe and kind of some demographic trends there. But I think from a young generation, we're all optimistic, even if there's a little bit of cynicism creeping in, like I described earlier. I think we all see this as an opportunity to move forward and cooperate. And I think the key is we're all together. East-West cooperation, I mentioned this earlier too, might be more important than North-South cooperation right now. Finding ways as an Arctic community to work beyond borders, to work together, find ways culturally, environmentally, economically to build ties, rather than relying on the national capitals to kind of dictate what policy is going to be. I think that's really important, and I think that's where organizations and conferences like Arctic Frontiers, like the Arctic Youth Conference, and of course have to plug the Emerging Leaders Program, do a great job of kind of pulling that East-West group together. I
totally agree on that, and that's a very, very good thing of the Arctic Frontiers, is putting people with very different backgrounds together, working in a common way with Arctic issues.
Thank you very much. Trying to be inclusive. Thank you very much, Stephanie, Dave, and Thomas, and thank you very much for having watched us again. This has been the 4th round of Arctic Frontiers Offstage at Arctic Frontiers 2025, Beyond Borders. 2 more to come, so keep on watching us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.